Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first plenary session here. I'm Michael Kerrin, and I'm the Chief Executive of St Joseph's Hospice in London and the Advisory Council member for London. It is my great pleasure to chair this session. This is an important issue that we're talking about this morning, and I suppose there is a preciousness that one could describe in very sort of vague terms in the hospice movement between, on the one hand, the value of information and outcome measures. Well, palliative care is all very complex, isn't it? Too complex to measure in that way, or we're too unique, or indeed, you can't measure compassion, so how do we do it? And on the other hand, where one hears the complaints, well, all of these systems, they're complex, they're expensive, they take us from our main issues, which is to provide care. And I suppose in a sense both are true, but they're increasingly irrelevant in a world, as we've already heard, where information systems and digital support are so important. And I suppose it's a point that I should be the first to remind you all that you can engage digitally with the conference and get a lot about the speakers and the sessions through the hashtag, and if you Twitter, there's copious opportunities to do that. So you can be both real and virtual at the same time. I hope, though, that you will be real for this session because we've got two very good speakers here with me today. Unfortunately, our third speaker, Sarah Rawlins, broke her wrist at the weekend and so can't be with us. But I suppose this is an important session, not least because it is for everyone. As you can see from the programme, there are some things that seem to have a more English flavour, but this is certainly one that the entire Hospice UK movement can engage with. And it's one in which we do look outwards, and I'm really pleased this morning that our two speakers will hopefully give us not just a view from elsewhere, but in their own ways a broad view from elsewhere. And so I'll introduce the speakers and then we'll start. And on my left, I don't know if that means whether you're a troublemaker or a rebel by being on this side of me, but Malcolm Roxburgh may have the title of Chief Knowledge Officer in the Directorate of Public Health England. You were saying beforehand that your job title is a bit sort of indeterminate. Malcolm joined PHE from the National Treatment Agency for Drugs and Alcohol, and where he had responsibility for the organisation's information management and information governance. And he's also worked on national and international diabetes-related projects and with a number of organisations that you can see in his biography. And his background is in information system engineering and has worked across a number of sectors and has a strong interest in health data management. So I hope, if you like, the view from the centre, that's one of the national organisations. On my right, and again I'll leave him to decide whether he's a troublemaker or a rebel, is John Barton, who's the Special Projects Manager for Turning Point. And I suppose Turning Point is one of those really interesting organisations that serves a number of different groups and in a variety of ways. And so I think from Johnny we'll be getting perhaps a view from a doing organisation serving a number of different client areas, which will be interesting for us. I was looking at a recent presentation he'd done on using information sharing technology to improve outcomes for individuals and the community. And I think there'll be a particular resonance for hospices in both looking at individuals and the community. Because Sarah is unable to join us, both speakers are stepping into the breach, perhaps to extend their contribution slightly longer than they'd intended, but the aim is that there will be plenty of time for questions and comments, and without more ado, I'll invite Malcolm to go first and open the discussion. Thank you.
in practice, I moved from drugs and alcohol to work with palliative care, or with the National End-of-Life Care Information Network, Care Intelligence Network, about 3 months ago. And I think it was, well, this afternoon I'll be talking about the proposals and the plans that there are going forward to try and introduce some national data collection within specialist palliative care. But this morning it was thought it would be useful for me and Johnny to share our experiences of building these types of data collections. It's not all good, it's not all bad, but I think it's important that we understand and we reflect on the experiences of other sectors in building these things and try and learn from that in order to make this happen properly in this particular field. So, without further ado, as was stated in the introduction, I've got experience of working across a number of different clinical areas, but there are two national collections which I've been very involved in the setting up and development of. One was something called the United Kingdom Diabetes Information Analysis and Benchmarking Service, which was set up by the National Patient Charity, which was then British Diabetic Association, now Diabetes UK. And that collection, over time, was the forerunner, really, of what today is the National Diabetes Audit, which is run by the Health and Social Care Information Centre. But that started some time ago and was at a very early stage of the development of these types of collections. The other one which I was involved in and set up was the drug and alcohol treatment, which was, we'll come on to have a look at that, which in many ways is quite analogous to the situation around data collection and some of the problems and obstacles that will be faced within palliative care. So I think without further ado, we'll have a quick look at the diabetes. Okay, my background was that I joined Diabetes UK, or as it was, British Diabetic Association, in 1995. A clinical data set had been published by a Professor Philip Home in 1991, and it was decided that it would be a good idea to see whether or not this data could be collected by the patient charity. So in many ways, this is in the same timing and the same type of thinking as went behind the minimum data set in palliative care. It was a different era. We had a data set, we had some enthusiastic clinicians, and in those days, the clinicians would collect clinical data on standalone PCs in hospital departments or on local GP systems. And my job was to go around, help people configure those systems, work with the suppliers of those systems, and try and configure them so that they collected data in a standardized way. I would then go visit those sites. Thinking about it now, it is, I guess, get immediately sacked even for thinking about this. We would collect the patient data on floppy disk, put it in my pocket, go home on the train and put it into a database at the Patient Association. Couldn't do that now, but we did that back in the early 90s. We worked with the suppliers. We managed to do that, and we managed to get all the various interested groups who wanted to contribute configured so that they could submit data to the audit. And by 1999, we'd built a database which covered 60 or 70 different clinical providers, mostly in secondary care, but not exclusively. And we had around about 1 million diabetes records sitting on a database at Diabetes UK. This in turn led to us being involved in the development of international comparisons. I did some work for the World Health Organization advising other countries in Europe on how to set up similar data collection systems, and was for a time seconded to the Royal College of Physicians to work on this. So that's briefly where we were with Diabetes UK. And you've got to remember, this is very early on in the development of these types of national data collections. And, well, what did we find? Well, this is the kind of thing we were meant to be producing, and this is the kind of thing that we did produce. And here is a benchmark graph which is showing the proportion of patients in a particular service with a creatinine level of over 200. And we produced these graphs, and then we'd look at them and we'd say, well, okay, what does that tell us? And actually, we had no idea what it told us. I mean, actually, what it told us was that what it seemed to be telling us that in some clinics, we'd see patients much more at the end stage of diabetes in terms of the complications than in others, which is not that surprising. In general practice, you wouldn't expect to see you'd expect to see a lot of patients who are well managed. Sometimes in acute hospitals you'd get patients who weren't so well managed with complications. And essentially what this told us was more about the case mix than it told us about the ability of clinicians to deliver quality care. So in that sense, UK DIABS did not really deliver what it was there to initially set up to achieve. However, I mean, this is just illustrative, but what we also did with the data, we had 1 million records. And this was the first time that we'd had that kind of information available to us in anywhere in the world, really, to investigate the epidemiology of diabetes. And in practice, what that turned out to provide us with was a lot of very detailed information that we could look at on a national basis that would tell us a lot of things about diabetes we hadn't known before. One of the things we did was to look at the incidence of complications arising from diabetes and look at the implications of the timeline, how many complications people had over time. And from that we were able to figure out that it was between 9 and 12 years after somebody developed diagnosis, which was the average time before which they were diagnosed and treated. Similarly, we found things in the data that suggested that aggressive treatment of microvascular complications leads to worse macrovascular outcomes. So there were quite important things that came out of that data that have been investigated and researched since. Okay, there were a number of important learning experiences I think we should take from UK DIABS. One is that the system itself and the data collection was set up by clinicians for clinicians. It was set up through the patient charity, but it was set up in order for clinicians to be able to look at their caseload and their management against other clinicians. And I would present those findings back to the clinicians, go to conferences, present what we had, and people would take that away and do what they wanted with it. It wasn't something which was centrally managed, it wasn't centrally focused on performance, it was simply about trying to help people improve their performance. And with that type of approach, clinicians were almost universally very supportive and very keen to participate. Patient groups were, of course, very supportive. In fact, in this case, it was initially started and paid for by the patient organisation. An important learning, which no doubt will also resonate in this sector, is that integrating primary and secondary care data collections is a difficult thing to do. Both technologically, data is collected in a different way, and politically, it's not something which is very simple to achieve. Benchmarking without case mix is a waste of time. It doesn't tell you anything about quality. What it tells you is something about case mix, something about the population that you're treating. However, by collecting lots of data, you will be able to provide important public health insights into a particular condition and its treatment. Since 1999, or 2000, when I left, the data collection has been through a couple of different owners. First of all, it went to CQC. It now rests with the HSCIC, who use it to monitor mostly secondary care performance against NICE guidelines. And it's very successful. You can go and have a look at it yourself. There's lots of data that tells each individual hospital how they're doing against quality standards and how they're doing against other hospitals. But that completion of the exercise and that ability to turn what was an interesting project into something which is now today driving diabetes care required a central driver. It required a central organisation who had both the authority, the capacity and the skill and the resources to make that into something which it is today, and that was the HSCIC. Okay, so that's drugs and that's diabetes. Moving on to drugs and alcohol, which I began working in 2001. Now, the history of drugs and alcohol was that from about the 1980s, paper forms were completed every time somebody entered treatment. And that was sent to a central data collection point. Somebody entered the data onto a database, and that was used to do things like plot and monitor the heroin epidemic of the 1990s. It was data that could identify incidents. In 1997, the new Labour government came to power with a manifesto pledge to double the number of people in drug treatment, which was great. It was very good. It was wonderful for us, except that there was no baseline. We had an incidence model. We had incidence data. We didn't know how many people were being treated. So how would we know if we doubled the number of people we treated? And specifically, how would the government be able to demonstrate that they delivered that target? Well, the system didn't work. A new one was required after some faffing about between 2001 and 2003. In 2003, the Special Health Authority that had been set up to deliver that promise was given the responsibility of introducing a clinical data set and collecting data in from clinical services to be able to look primarily at that target, but of course from the Special Health Authority's perspective, it was also to develop commissioning and to improve quality within the sector. And that's still collected today by Public Health England. So, in terms of the use of the national of the drugs and alcohol collection, and if we're going back, it was used for very little except publication of some cursory high-level reports that didn't go anywhere and nobody believed. These days it's used for production of national statistics, it's used for performance management, it's used for commissioning, it's used by a range of other government departments, it's used by CQC. That what we've done over the time, once we'd got to the point where we'd got a complete national data set that was able to look at both process and outcome, we started to find that more and more organisations, government departments, CQC, etc., would come to us because we had the data that would allow them to do their jobs. So success breeds use to an extent. So a little schematic about the way in which the NDTMS worked, because this is approximately, although we're going back some time and there have been some technological changes, this is the kind of model that we'd be using in specialist palliative care. So on the left-hand side, what we had are three different types of clinical systems that fed the national data collection. The first were the clinical databases, and I think it would probably be fair to say that around about half of the services that provided drug and alcohol treatment had reasonable clinical systems at the outset. Some care was delivered in general practice from specialist GPs, so again we needed to work with GP system suppliers to get extracts through to a national database. But that still left a considerable number of providers, particularly at the beginning in the voluntary sector, that didn't really have the ability to collect and submit a central data return. So what we did is we developed a web-based tool, a secure web-based tool, which was able to collect both the clinical data set, but also do some basic management of things like patient caseloads and reporting, which we gave as a free-to-use device to services that wanted to contribute. I have to say that once we'd got past the initial stages, contribution wasn't really an option, but at the outset it was. That data would then be exported by services once a month into a file. A file was submitted then to the National Data Collection, and which was a system called DAMS, Drug and Alcohol Management System. And from that, we'd aggregate all the data together, be able to do various types of reporting from it. Firstly, we did the Office of National Statistics, or the National Statistics reporting from that, which was public-facing information about what was happening in drugs and alcohol. We did a lot of management reporting, and one of the main consumers of data are commissioners. Commissioners are very avid readers of all of the detail, or often were, and would be very interested in what we were doing. Similarly, services themselves wanted to receive information back from us that would identify how they were doing compared to other similar services. And finally, what we had was a system of regional support. So we had regional reporting, and we also had people sitting in each region in the country whose job it was to work with the clinical providers and the local commissioners in order to be able to explain some of the data and explain to people how that could be best used either for commissioning or for improving quality of care. Okay, now this is kind of where we are. I mean, don't worry too much about anything that's on this slide other than it's got a lot of segments. And these are the systems that we were working with in the drug and alcohol sector. Essentially, we had to work across a lot of providers in order to be able to do that. And if you look at the bottom where it says NDTMS debt, it was about, I don't know, maybe 15–20% of providers at this point in time. Remember, this is a good number of years after the introduction of the system, we're still using the data entry tool that we provided. And that still continues to this day. We never intended that web-based data collection tool to replace the use of clinical software systems, and always have encouraged people to get them. However, some don't, and we are still left supporting that by Public Health England. So just a few statistics about why this might resonate with palliative care. The number of registered agencies, this isn't the number of providers, these are the number of individual provider units, some of which will, of course, some providers have many provider units involved in drug and alcohol treatment. But what we had by beginning of this calendar year were about 3,000 registered providers, of which about 1,800, 1,900 were actually active. They went across mental health trusts, voluntary third sector, community drug teams, general practice, and we also collected data from the prison sector. And in any given month, we'd get around about 1,700 units providing their clinical data through to us. What that looked like in terms of volume, it was about 200,000 people a year were being treated for, are still currently being treated for drug and alcohol. And that relates, and when you looked at the data, that meant that each month we got submitted around about 600, 700,000 episodes, or I think you'd call them spells. And in total on the database, we had around about 2 million, what's modalities or individual units of care recorded over a period of about 7 years. So in some ways, although it's slightly smaller and maybe it's a little more fractured in terms of the way it's delivered, it's the way it sits across health and social care and some of the technological issues that were faced are, I think, quite similar to palliative care. Just a little bit about the way it worked. The data entry tool, just to show you a quick slide of what that looked like. It's not very exciting, it's not very whizzy, but what it did do was allow people to collect the data they needed to in practice. You could log on from any PC with an internet connection, and we would set up a secure connection through to the central database. The drug and alcohol management system was a slightly more complicated beast. I'm not going to worry too much about it, but what it would do is when an administrator, and this was the process of the central data collection, would submit a file once a month, what they do is they submit it to a database, and the database would get back to them with information about what was in that file. What records couldn't be counted for the purposes of, say, commissioning? Where would there potentially be problems with that data when it came to, and what could be done about it? And we provide a detailed list of the various bits and pieces we'd found in the data that had been submitted that was potentially problematic for the national collection. Provider units, when generally, again, administrators would go back, correct any data that we'd identified as wrong on the local database, and then would resubmit, and we'd be able to put that into our national collection. And that was, that was a monthly cycle. Once we'd done that, we had these 3 different ways of reporting it. So national statistics, and this is, obviously we had glossy publications, but we also had a site which was underpinned by a department at Manchester University called the National Drug Evidence Centre, which is part of I think it's the Department of Medicine these days. And that was just somewhere that anybody could go into, public, whoever, and could analyse aggregate data, produce their own charts, produce their own information about what was going on and how it looked. We have management reporting back to commissioners and service providers, and this is a typical commissioner report. We'd have a lot of aggregated data, there were 4 or 5 pages of this. They'd get that quarterly, and they'd be able to see everything that was happening inside the various services. They'd be able to look at the things like the care pathways, the way in which patients progressed between different providers, and we also had an outcomes tool which was developed during the process of the development of the NDTMS, and again they'd be able to look at the outcomes of their clients against the outcomes of similar clients elsewhere. They get very detailed information about that. And finally, as I say, we had a regional function as well. The regional function would talk to local commissioners or local service providers about issues that may be of particular interest to them. And again, in drugs and alcohol, it may be a particular drug that's more prevalent in one region than another that they wanted to focus on, or a particular group that needed some further investigation. And we'd support some of the work that was done regionally on the analysis into those as part of the programme of work. So I think there are a number of take-home messages from the NDTMS. One is that data collections can be built successfully across both health and voluntary sector. It's not easy, it's not necessarily that quick, but it certainly can be done. National data collections themselves can be used really quite successfully to drive up the quality of patient care once you can see what what's going on within clinical practice, generally speaking, clinical providers are very keen to understand that and understand what they can do to learn from similar situations elsewhere. It's also very good for the centre in terms of one of our remits is to make sure that we are trying to reduce health inequalities, and one of the things you get out of the data is a very strong indication of where there are inequalities. Outcomes are absolutely essential. Being able to define your outcomes, being able to monitor and measure them are a key component. If we're just measuring activity, that's very interesting in its own way, but it doesn't tell us anything about how we're actually delivering improved services to patients. One of the things which I think was a strong lesson from the NDTMS is that once the data is available, commissioning patterns will change, and they'll change based on the availability of data. That commissioners, as I've said before, are extremely avid consumers of information and of data, and often are quite creative in the ways in which they try and use that data to configure and manage local commissioning of services. I think, I'm sure Johnny will say this as well, sometimes I think it's quite important to ensure that the centre is, I think, working with the commissioners to make sure that they're not too creative sometimes. Good data, next lesson is that good data encourages further use of the collection. So if you've got good data, then researchers, international comparisons, the development of guidelines, it all comes back to this central data source. That it's like a virtuous circle. If you've got a good data collection, it becomes more widely used, and that improves the quality of the data within the sector. The NDTMS had, compared to the diabetes collections, the big difference was that with drugs and alcohol, there was a very strong political driver, a very strong political need to have a central understanding of what was happening in drug and alcohol treatment. And similarly, when diabetes moved over to the HSCIC, it was able to get out and to include more services than it had been while it was based at a patient charity. I don't think that's an issue for palliative care. There are manifesto or coalition agreements, and there is also the introduction of the per-patient funding mechanism, which will drive, I think, the collection within palliative care. Just a little one from me, that being the go-to source for information brings its own problems, and I think we were kind of bedeviled with the drugs and alcohol data collection with the Daily Mail trying to ring up and find out where there were 12-year-olds using heroin, and then trying to find out who they were and going to find them and interview. It's a bit of a nightmare, to be honest, but it comes with the territory. And a last one, which I think is going to be key in palliative care, is there will always be pressure to further develop and extend the data collection. That once you've got something that works, that every researcher with any question will come to you and want additions. Every commissioner will want additions. Every service provider will want additions. And if you're not careful and you don't manage the process, you end up with an enormous data collection. What we're going to start with in specialist palliative care is something small, but there will be pressures to expand that out. So I'm going to let you listen to Johnny tell you what it was like from the provider's perspective, and then hopefully will be some questions and answers. So thank you very much.
Just get everything arranged, got notes on iPhones, got notes on paper, and a watch to make sure I stick to time, because I know everybody will be getting hungry, because I know I am. Morning, or just afternoon now. I'm John Barton. I'm Turning Point's Client Outcomes and Information Manager, and I'm here to talk to you about some of the lessons we've learnt in trying to respond to Malcolm's demands, and also the demands of other commissioning bodies and regulatory bodies across where Turning Point operates. So, I've worked for Turning Point for the last 15 years and worked across a variety of roles in our central support functions with a nominal job title of Special Projects Manager, which meant I generally got lumbered with everything that didn't fit anywhere else. And that's how I came to be looking at outcomes. And in the last 8 years, I've managed our information systems across the organisation. Before I go on and bore you all with what Turning Point is, just a quick show of hands at the back of the room, which is a long way away, of who's heard of Turning Point before or had contact with us. Our marketing team will be very pleased then. Turning Point is a national social care organisation. We're a social enterprise. Formed in 1964, we're 50 this year. We deliver integrated services and specialist services across a range of health and social care areas. We're mainly known for our substance misuse work, but we also work in mental health and learning stability. They're our core sectors. And we also work in primary care. We run a GP clinic in Camden for the homeless population there. We work within the criminal justice system. We actually operate out of 3 prisons across England. And we work in employment. We actually use our core skills to help people back into work and supplement the work of specialist employment services. And we also have a business-to-business offering selling to employers so that they can help their staff through the type of issues that we can support them with as well. We operate in 200 sites across England and Wales. We do have a sister organisation in Scotland, but they operate very separately. And on any given day, we'll have around 25,000 people active in our caseload. They're working with 3,500 staff. So as you can imagine, that in itself generates a huge amount of information, which we can use to evidence our work and prove what we do. Back in 2005, Turning Point commissioned Tribal Consulting to help us on the journey of being able to prove what we used to say in the tin. We've recently rebranded and we now say inspired by possibility, which of course we are. But we used to say turning lives around, which was far more easy for me to explain as an outcomes manager. But we wanted to be able to prove that. We kicked off this piece of work and the Outcomes Project was born. And I was asked to manage it as a special project. 9 years later, here I am. And this is the timeline of the journey that we've been on to achieving, proving, turning lives around. The report from Tribal was published in around early 2006. And essentially their main conclusion was there isn't a tool. There is nothing out there that you'll be able to use across the breadth of your service delivery to prove what you actually want to prove. But that wasn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem was we didn't know who we were actually seeing. Each of our services, hundreds of locations, all had their own local database, their own local system. From off-the-shelf products, things like Bomic, which was sort of very big in the day, all the way through systems that were sort of homebrew in workers' bedrooms. We actually had a system called Anorak, believe it or not. And it went all the way through to true back-of-a-fag packet statistics. That tally charts, that capturing stuff until that last minute when you needed to pass it over to the NTA. So it was clear we needed to implement something nationwide. In August 2006, we started piloting KIM. KIM stands for Client Information Management. It's actually an off-the-shelf product called Lynx CarePath for Millie Systems. And we knew we needed it, and we knew we needed to roll it out. We did a fairly quick proof of concept pilot. Does it work? Can we install it? Will the computers run it? We knew we needed to hit the ground running if we were going to make change. And from October 2006 onwards, we rolled this system out across all the locations we were working in. It was a very long and painful process, particularly as my son was just been born in between the pilot starting and going live. We learned a lot during that process, not just about information systems, but how you roll out change across an organisation that goes from Newcastle to Dorset, Cumbria to Kent, and everywhere in between. It was a massive, massive challenge. One of the key things was that all the data that we had in the systems that we already had in-house, we had to migrate over into the new tool. As Malcolm mentioned, NDTMS, the National Drug Treatment Monitoring System, fed official national statistics. In many ways, it paid the bills because it drove the funding formulas. It was key that we didn't lose anybody in that transition period. That was a lot of work, and to be honest, it's one of those never-ending implementations because you're always opening somewhere, you're always closing somewhere. In October 2007, the NTA, as was, launched TOP, which is the Treatment Outcomes Profile. It's a list of 20 questions which look at people's substance misuse, so how many days they're using and how much they're using, their offending behaviours, which most people always answer 0 to when you ask them how many times have you done shoplifting, etc. Social functioning questions of how happy are you, in essence. It's your overall quality of life. What's your psychological health like? What's your physical health like? Housing status, harm reduction. We had our first piece of that outcomes jigsaw. Tribal said there wasn't a tool that could do it all, but we'd just been given one and mandated the collection of it by one of our key regulators. As I say, we work in something wider than substance misuse, mental health learning disabilities. CarePath was an off-the-shelf product designed for the substance misuse services. That didn't sit well with our mental health and learning disability colleagues. It was too drugsy. So we decided to implement their own version. We could turn off some of that crucial validation so that when the files hit DAMS, our drugs data was nice and clean. Well, that actually got in the way of the rest of the business. So it's about understanding what your services deliver and building a system that meets that need. In 2009, we launched our Arrow toolkit internally, which had the mental health providers recovery star in, which is, again is sort of this quality of life tool we'll look at a bit later on. But it was our second piece in the outcomes jigsaw. We can now prove turning lives around in substance misuse and in mental health. All the time, though, the organisation's changing underneath us. New initiatives come out from government. One of the key ones was EyeUp services. EyeUp services are what are now known as talking therapies. Services for people with anxiety, depression issues. Huge numbers of throughput through them. Our Wakefield service, just down the road, is 600 referrals a month alone, and they want more. For us, that was a big step change in the data that we had to capture. We had a system in place, it wasn't fit for purpose, so we had to get something new that was. Drugs PBR, payment by results, kicked in April 2012 for a small pilot of services, driven by the NTA as it itself transitioned into PHE. It was a big opportunity for us as data providers to be able to use the information to prove what we say, to get paid, to do more of what we say, to get paid, to do more of what we say. In April 2013, Turning Point opened 18 new substance misuse services on the same day, April the 1st, which was a bit of a headache to say the least. These services were across 4 counties, Kent, Gloucestershire, Wiltshire, West Berkshire. There's also some stuff that went live in Northumberland that I don't even remember. But you had to respond to the need and we had to migrate the data. All the data that was there on the 31st of March with our NHS colleagues had to be there on the 1st of April for when they TUPE transferred over. We needed to deliver continuity of care. By March 2014, in that year after all those implementations, we printed 171,000 prescriptions from the KIM system. That's 80 an hour, which is quite a big number for the type of service that we deliver. We started off wanting a system to prove outcomes, and we ended up with one that presented clinical data that had to be accurate and had to be correct. Listening to Malcolm talk, I wanted to add another arrow on the end of this arrow, that with the NDTMS dataset, which is now has grown over time, it's fair to say, it's 200 columns of data now. We probably submit around 100,000 rows of data across Turning Point's provision, which my maths says that's about 20 million cells of data, and that's within a month. So having a system that does most of that for you and takes the pressure off staff is crucial going forward. Obviously, we've met a few challenges along the way, but for me, there's one key challenge, and I'm sure that will resonate across people within the room. I don't come to work to use a computer, I come to help people. The vast majority of people who work for Turning Point are care professionals. Social workers, nurses, doctors, support workers working in learning disability services. Difficult job. They don't come to work to use a computer. That could be a key worker. Actually, it could be lots of key workers. To be honest, it's most key workers. So the key challenge for us implementing the system wasn't necessarily the technology. System suppliers will always tell you everything's technically possible. The key challenge is people. And how you manage that relationship through and how you get the best out of your staff's time and input, but yet feeding the process of which at the end of the day is going to be crucial to your future funding and future survival is really difficult. We use the carrot and stick methodology as most people would. So where we get good data, it's generally down to good managers, good leadership, allowing people to see the value in data, reviewing data with staff on a day-to-day basis or within sessions as you use it to develop. But also that carrot to workers to be able to say, look at the difference you made to this person's life. Look at the change that you helped assist with. And by putting it in the system, you can actually prove that. As PBR came along, we had that concept of Kim as the till. If it wasn't in the till, you didn't do it. Unfortunately, that's the stage where you can get to, but you've got to therefore make it engaging. People understand that by filling this information in, they prove what they do on a day-to-day basis. They go home with that warm, fuzzy feeling, but actually they can prove it to somebody else, and the organisation can grow and thrive. One of the key drivers to our system has always been that we listen as well. We've been using the same tool for 8 years now. And one of the key things is that it's developed over time. We've listened to our staff base. We can implement their feedback with our vendors and develop the system, which in turn encourages better data, more feedback, and you get this virtuous circle of people actually wanting to use the system, about people being excited because they themselves were enabling change. And before I forget the last point, what we've done is we've given our workers the tools to do their job. So in order to make them want to log into the system in the morning, there's a lovely dashboard that at a glance tells them who they're seeing that day, who's coming in, who they need to review the care plan with, who they need to check up on. All the contact details are there at a glance. They can see where they're going. They don't need to go trawling through and searching for records. They can do everything from the first page they see in the morning. And that's key as well. But as I said, this was all about outcomes. And over time, we've been trying to achieve the outcomes trinity. We want to try and prove things in as many possible ways as we can. It's an ever-shifting goal, and I've often got bogged down in the implementation of a system or a new site or changing something around or fixing a problem with the tool. But this is what gets me out of bed. This is what I want to be able to do, is prove outcomes. We've got the CLOMS, PROMS and PREMS, more acronyms. We love an acronym within the health and social care sector. Clinical outcome measures. PHQ-9 and GAD-7. So those are the tools that we use within our EyeUp and talking therapy services. How levels of depression and anxiety. We take those every time we sit down with somebody within those type of services. So it's a huge amount of data and an incredibly rich data set. HONOS and SARN. HONOS is the Health of the Nation Outcomes Score, and it's part of the PBR toolset within mental health services. And SARN is the historical element of that. We don't have a huge number of clinicians We're becoming more of a clinical organisation as we move into more NHS-driven services. But we've always been more about the patient-centred. Patient is a word we don't really use. Client-centred outcomes. And these patient-reported outcome measures are the bit that workers do every 12 weeks. So we've got TOP, which for some reason this presentation seems to have inverted. So in substance misuse, we're asking these 20 questions every 12 weeks or so. The guidance says do it every 26 weeks, but we do it every 12 because we like to see that granular improvement of people through time. See drug use going down, to see social functioning going up. That evidencing that treatment works. Drug treatment is one of those things that's never popular to fund. But if we can prove that it works, we can retain and develop that funding going forward. Within mental health, we use the Recovery Star tool, which again we help develop with other mental health providers. We got in a room, said we need an outcomes tool, and we developed one with our clients in the room as well. Which of these outcomes resonate for you? And we've got a few more slides about the Outcomes Star in a moment. And then we've got patient-reported experience measures. We've got friends and family tests coming down the track. It's there in the NHS now, in acute services and outpatient. It's going to be coming into mental health services this month. And we'll have a wider currency. That general Cameron question, are you happy with the service you've got? Whether it be someone taking your bins out or someone delivering care service to one of your relatives or you. We use patient evaluation questionnaires in EyeUp. And we're also registered on patient opinion, so people can give feedback, which is then visible to other customers as well. This is the outcomes trinity. By having all this in place, we can start to tell a really rich story of how we turn lives around, what outcomes we deliver for our end customers and their families and other stakeholders and our commissioners and our funders at the most strategic level. I'll dwell on the Mental Health Providers Forum Recovery Star for a bit. This was the slide I dropped in last night when I found Sarah had dropped out. This is one of my favourite slides, and I like presenting this to our board because it's a real demonstrator of change. The Outcomes Star is done every 12 weeks within our mental health services and looks at a wide range of life domains, from managing your mental health, which is obviously one of the key ones, through to work behaviours, social networks. How are your addictions doing? Because obviously people have very many of dual diagnosis. We think it's at least 1 in 5, not 1 in 4 coming through the doors, and that's underreported. But over time you can see how people get better. It's a fascinating process, a journey over a 2-year period of how people can start in real need, that we can work with them and support them to the point where they can move on. Actually, if you take some of the noise out of this, you're left with the first reading. One of the key triggers is getting into treatment, getting support. It can make a massive shift. At that first viewpoint, you've jumped. And then everything else is a concentric change. But 2 years down the line, and we can evidence that our 2-year down the line services have made a difference. But what's fascinating is you can also look at it the other way. Where aren't we making a difference? What's going wrong, or what are the sticking points? We notice people going backwards at 18 months. It's like, ooh, why is that? And it's simple. It was a 2-year service, and people were getting worried about moving out. They were getting worried about that comfort blanket being stripped out from under them. Their patient satisfaction scores were through the roof. They were happy where they wanted to be. But their outcome scores were dwindling. So we can adjust our packages of care to make sure there's extra support at that stage, that exit planning happens earlier. So we're making a difference to the clients from the noughts and ones that we've got in the back end of the system. We can drive improvement through data in a different way as well. The Wakefield service down the road was one of the PBR pilots for the NTA. And Many of the PBR pilots experience this. Is actually the pressure of being funded by what you do had a fairly adverse effect on performance. People started holding on to clients until they were really better because they had to make them better because that paid the bills. We got to the point where we were comparatively one of the worst services in the country, which is not what we were trying to do. The team locally, with the help from the performance team, using the data from the system, were able to look at, okay, what are we doing? They kind of took that British cycling Team Sky approach of accumulation of marginal gains. What are those 100 little things that we can do better? They started looking at who are the closest 3 clients to recovery based upon top, and doing intensive work for each of those key workers with those clients. Doing full case reviews, having information funneling out of the system that allowed you to manage caseload better, to adjust case mix for certain workers, to actually start getting results. And as you can see, the climb was quite dramatic. Take a step back from the data, look at it, work out what it says for you, and then use it to drive improvement across the service. The proof will be in the pudding. This service has been up for re-tender recently, and at some point in the next couple of weeks we're going to find out whether we've been successful. Fingers crossed. Not least because our chief exec's from Wakefield, and it's a big, big win for us. We've got another service in Wakefield. We've got an EyeUp service. They're in the same building. They're on the top floor. And this talking therapy service also had a similar story. Their data was pretty low. Their recovery rate was around 16%. Anecdotally, someone told me that, well, 18% of people will get better from anxiety, depression issues by themselves. So actually, we seemed that we were actually making people worse when you looked at the statistics. That wasn't true, I'm sure, but their problem wasn't the data that they were putting in, it was what they were putting it into. The system that they'd had, which sort of came with the service, wasn't really fit for purpose. So we implemented the EyeUp system, which is specialist, off the shelf, all it was built for. And performance flew through the roof. From 16% to 6 months later, we're hitting 60%, the national target being 50%. And that really was down to many ways that we'd implemented a system that was fit for purpose. So having the right system, actually you can let systems drive business processes at times. I would often do it the other way around. What is your process will develop your system. But actually sometimes if the system's that good, you can just let it rip and let it change. We're now seeing over 10,000 people a year across our talking therapy services, and we can evidence at what point people are getting better, that again, that instant improvement, that longer tail, and as people move finally to recovery as we work with their issues. It's episodic though, so having a system there that can prove it, what you did last time, you have that recovery capital so you can start again when you come forward. In terms of, as I come to the end now, some tips for you guys as a hospice sector working with Malcolm and PHE and other stakeholders in how you manage this data set. It's your sector, it's your data. And I think there are some key lessons that I know I learned in engaging with the providers. We've got a number of customers for our data. The NHS, Public Health England, NTA as was. I still call them the NTA every day. It's 2 years after they've changed. The Health and Social Care Information Centre are our customers for our mental health data. And they seem to have an event upstairs as well today. You could all feed in individually to the consultation that's out there at the minute to get engaged. I represent providers, in inverted commas, with some of my colleagues from the bigger substance misuse organisations. We go to Public Health England every other month to talk about what the data set's doing, what the systems are doing at the other end. By feeding in individually, it's piecemeal. Stronger together. Feeding in with all the providers coming together, working out what they are. If you're going to benchmark the data against you to prove your performance, you want to all be agreeing on what the data set is. Use your system vendors. If you're buying a system off the shelf, it's highly likely that that system vendor will be in this market already, will be in that health space. They'll already know what buttons to press and how we get the information up and how we influence what the data sets are. We've had many heated discussion on whether it should be this type of field or that type of field. It's a healthy debate, but it means that at the end of the day, you can't say, oh, they're doing it to me. Do it with them. Work together as a sector. So, where next? As I say, everything continues to change, and I think, I would put a slide up with lots of snazzy devices on, because that's when I go out, people want the next step. They want to be able to doing it more. Plus, we've got the external market there. We've got the appification of healthcare. My Apple phone, if it wasn't a lectern and I'm pacing around here, is counting how many steps I'm doing in a day. Down the line, we can use that. I could pair that with, say, my depression and anxiety scores and work out the days I've been for a run, whether my anxiety is better or not. Those types of evidence-based things allow us to adjust different treatments, allow us to adapt packages of care. Patient-held records or family-held records, perhaps, within the hospice sector, involving people in their care, allowing them to input thought diaries at how they're engaging, let them record their own outcomes instead of having to sit with somebody. More rich data direct from the horse's mouth. Online referral portals. Everybody now expects that you can just pick the phone up and book in somewhere. Book on lastminute.com. I could do that 8 years ago when I first launched this system, but I can't yet book into one of our services online. And that's crucial. In an information age, we need to be engaging. And mobility. And that doesn't necessarily need to be out in the community. It could be within the unit, within the building. I was at Smithfield in Manchester last week, which is our inpatient detox facility. So very nurse-driven, people detoxing from opiates or alcohol. And the nurses were saying, well, I have to go back to my desk to type in these notes. Why can't I just have Wi-Fi in the building and be able to input it on the tablet as I go? And all this is, of course, technically possible. We've got to find the funding to be able to do it, but it is there. And that's how we drive that continual change cycle, getting people involved in feeding information into the beast. Not just somebody sat there being the evil king of numbers, but actually using the information. The more information we've got, the more we can prove. Inspired by possibilities, turning lives around, whichever we say in the tin, the information is what allows us to say that we actually do it. Thank you.
Thank you to both our speakers. I think there's a number of clues there for questions and discussion, which I'm sure will continue after this session. But would anyone like to make any observations or questions to our two speakers? Would you like to say who you are first, please?
Yeah, hello, I'm Sam Cheverton. I work for Sue Ryder, and I've got a question for John, please. When I was listening to your presentation, I could resonate a lot of the things you were saying with the situation we're in Sue Ryder. We've got 7 hospices, and it was particularly the quote about a key worker saying that they don't come to work to use a computer, they come to care. And I think that's very often said, and even if there is a will for people to want to use the computer, actually time is the factor and inhibits somebody being able to do that. Now, you talked about carrot and stick, and you talked about having a really easy dashboard for people to use, so it's all there for them. But I just wondered if you got any other examples of what worked well for you in helping bridge that, really, particularly maybe in enabling time, because that's often the most difficult factor, and any quick wins.
I think for me, a time point of view, that's the one thing that I can't magic out of thin air. And I think it is about prioritising, it's about adjusting work patterns. So creating appointments or sessions that allow a little bit of admin time at the end, or creating admin space down the line. I'm not anti-paper in any way, shape or form. And I think that idea of your quick notes that then get entered later on, depends how contemporaneous you want your notes to be, depending how quickly someone's condition is evolving and that type of thing. So trying to not do away with the simple processes is what we try to do as well. I think taking the steps out, So if someone's got to log onto a computer and then log into a system and then find a record and then go to the page where they write their notes, then enter it in, then get it approved by somebody, you can take out some of that waste within the process. I think the other thing is that it's about how the teams that are implementing systems engage with the staff on the ground. My team has absolutely no IT background, which is interesting because we've just moved into the IT team, so there's a bit of a culture clash there. I'm an archaeologist by training. My second in command is a classicist, and our support line is staffed by someone who used to teach drama in higher education and a maths teacher. So we're people. When somebody rings up, they're not getting, can you log a ticket? They're getting, I know what you do on a day-to-day basis. I know the problems you're going through. Get a cup of tea. I'll take over your computer and I'll show you how to do it again. So it's about stakeholder management, staff engagement. They are the information generators. They are the point where data comes from. So you need to be able to engage them.
Malcolm, do you have any thoughts on getting buy-in in that way?
I think it's certainly difficult at the outset. I think there's a point at which certainly for us, we'd gone from a situation where the data that was being collected centrally wasn't seen as being representative either of performance or being useful in any way to improve quality in the sector. I think after a year or two of data collection, it got to the stage where people started to recognise the data that was coming out centrally as being reflective of what they were producing. And once the outcomes had been added in, there was, I think as Johnny has described, the ability to demonstrate and be able to see that putting that data in actually ended up with better patient care at the end of it. So there's a kind of hearts and minds thing here. If you can get to the point where people, care workers, believe that the data that they're collecting can and will be used to improve patient care for the individual or for patients in future, then it becomes a much easier battle to fight. But you've got to get through that initial phase.
Okay, there was another hand here as well. Where's the microphone gone?
Christine Gibbons, trustee of Hospice UK. A question for Malcolm and John. What would you do differently if you could turn back time and start your projects again? One thing.
It would be, I think I would want to slow down the pace of progression, that we moved from a small data set to a very big data set trying to do many things over a period of about 3 or 4 years. And in retrospect, I think too much was pushed too quickly. That I think building up something slowly and with, I mean, yes, we built in the right kind of validations, the right kind of academic input into the new measures that we were bringing into the data set. But to actually bring the field with you, you need to spend time and energy engaging and making sure that they're on board. And that's something which I'd be wanting to bring to palliative care more, I think, than we had in the drugs and alcohol sector.
And I think I'd be on the other side of that. If I had my time again, I'd stop and I'd think and I'd plan. We didn't have that luxury. It was kind of dump. And then just as you got used to that, there was change. So being able to plan, having a planning horizon of 3 to 5 years would make a huge difference to the quality of the product and the data you get out of the other end.
I mean, while we're moving on, how helpful or unhelpful was a central driver to all of this? Because, of course, palliative care is quite a dispersed world.
It is. I mean, it was probably critical at the early stages. In the early stages, it was taking an unwilling field that had felt they'd been kicked about by the previous government, that it kind of needed that, and it needed that initial push, and it needed that initial thing. It doesn't really now. It continues now, I think, because the field, there isn't that same central driver, there isn't the same policy drivers within drugs and alcohol, but the fact the field know themselves that they have data which describes what they do, describes how they improve people's lives. It shows that the value of what's being achieved, and that keeps the services funded. And I think that's probably the main driver for the data collection today.
And I think that the key thing is that actually NDTMS is the best thing that ever happened to us as an organisation, because it gave us a framework. Instead of everybody thinking, I want to report this and I want to report that, that we had a standard framework of what was being reported. It was painful, and you had to train people, and you had to get them used to funny words like modalities, which they then got rid of, just as we got everybody used to it. But there was we had a common language, we had a common interchange that we could talk to commissioners about, that we could talk to other providers about, that we could use as our information data, and that was really important for me.
Other questions? It's a big gloomy sort of, can't see. Yes, there's some hands over there. Brilliant.
I'm Elizabeth Bailey. I'm the Medical Director of East Lancashire Hospice. But before I came into this role, I was a nephrologist for 26 years. And I think that the palliative care field can learn something from the renal registry and the kind of data that's been collected for that for a very long time. And at first that was anonymised data, and there was a bit of a fear factor involved in looking at the data. You knew where your unit was, but you didn't know everybody else's. And there was a bit of a shame factor there as well if you were doing badly in some element compared to other units. And then it became de-anonymised, and then it was a culture of, well, here I can identify a dialysis centre that is doing really well in managing whatever you are looking at. Why aren't we what are they doing that we aren't? What can we learn from them? How can we implement that? What ammunition does this give us to go to funding bodies to say, these are the resources that we need to be able to achieve this high standard? And that, I think, has made a massive difference and taken away some of the postcode lottery, so that wherever you have your dialysis treatment in the country, you should be expecting the same standards. And perhaps palliative care can learn something from that.
I'd agree. I mean, having worked with the diabetes audit that was initially anonymised and then moving on to the drugs and alcohol, which isn't, and providers can see other providers' outcomes, I'd absolutely endorse that by understanding where it is that people are being successfully treated. If you're not successfully treating, you know where to go and get that learning. And that's enormously useful. But there is, I think, initially at the stage, and I mean, you wouldn't have had this with the renal registry even 26 years ago. I think it was still pretty mature. There's a point where you're collecting data that nobody really fully understands, and nobody really completely understands what the data that's being published means in terms of the quality of the service. And I think you need to get past that stage initially so that there is a common language and a common way of comparing the way in which outcomes are happening within different providers before it's a good idea to be too public about it. But I'm not one for wanting to provide too much anonymity, but that may not be the flavour of the way in which things come out from Public Health England.
I think it's about getting the indicators right about what you're going to publish. There was another indicator for the graph I put up of where we were getting better in Wakefield, where we're getting better with treating opiate people, but unless you're in the sector, the percentages look incredibly low, because actually what the calculation is based upon is something that not many people outside of the sector understand. All this data, whatever's published, what you should be able to boil it down to for me is, are we getting people drug-free and are we making them happy? So those actual social values, things that last, are we getting people a home back, are we getting their kids back, are we getting them a job? And it's those things that make change. And they sometimes get lost in the myriad of how many people did you have through the sausage machine type of reporting. So there's a balance that needs to be struck.
I mean, Malcolm, you mentioned at one point the need to define your outcomes and then moved on. Is this something you're coming back to this afternoon session, or?
Yes, we will be talking. We'll be talking about it this afternoon. I mean, clearly, it's been a very active debate within palliative care. The number of different tools out there. I mean, the one that is favoured in terms of the National Clinical Data Set, at least the piloting of it, is a partial use of the iPOS. But that is something which is out for consultation, and I'd be interested to hear people's views this afternoon on us going down that route.
So if you want to follow that up, there's the Strand this afternoon. There's a hand waving vigorously at the back, so we'll make that the last question, if you don't mind.
I was just interested in you saying about the working with system suppliers, because I guess my question to you is, what incentive have system suppliers got to work with something at the moment which is undetermined, and it's not a very wide market? It's not going to make them a lot of money. So how have you handled that in terms of making sure that the systems are adapted to be fit for purpose?
I think it's a good question. I mean, it's something which has been surprisingly not too bad at all over the years. Now, that's not the same. Different system suppliers will work differently, but generally speaking, if there is a sea change in the way in which data is managed within the field, that will generate quite a lot of new changes to systems, new business. And suppliers will see it in their interest to be working closely and be seen to be working closely with whatever that central data collection is. And remember, although I'm speaking with the Public Health England Act on here today, and we are interested in looking at patient data to improve the quality of outcomes of care, that there's also, as part of this, the introduction of the per patient funding mechanism. So there is going to be a need for some data flow through to the centre, which this will manage, which will feed the information that NHS England want to be able to introduce those currencies. So there is going to be a need on the part of services that are accessing NHS funding to be able to provide reliable data to a central source. Now that requirement stimulates the market for software suppliers, and software suppliers will want to be able to demonstrate that they're able to supply all the central data needs. And already quite a lot of the suppliers have been knocking at my door saying, please can we implement this as quickly as possible. There will be some problems. It took us 5 or 6 years to get System 1 to produce the data for drugs and alcohol, but we've done it with all the suppliers that we wanted to, and haven't actually paid their money to do that. It's been something they've done for their own commercial purposes.
I think that from a provider's point of view, when we're going out to vendors and asking systems, and just looking down at the screen here and seeing who this event's sponsored by, there is obviously players within the market wanting to help. But from sitting where you guys are, you're the customer. Don't just buy a system that does the data set. Buy a system that does what you need to be able to do in your bit of the world. Allow your needs to be primary, and if you do it right and engage with the consultation, the data set should flow out of the back. That point that we started off with a data collection tool, but now we have a clinical management system that produces hundreds of thousands of prescriptions a year. The data that comes out the back is now secondary to the primary use of using it to manage our caseload and using it to look at the information to make our relationship with our stakeholders better.
And I think that's a really good point to end on, it being just approaching 1 o'clock. I want to thank both our speakers and on our behalf. And I think one of the interesting things for me is that perhaps we're not such a small market after all, when you consider, first of all, the number of people who are in the room who are interested in the subject, and secondly, that we are engaged in an area where there are over 500,000 deaths a year and growing, and therefore the whole need for knowledge in this area is really important. So I hope we all take food for thought away with the view from other sectors as we head for food for the stomach. But can I encourage you to thank both our speakers for their contributions to the session.